Welcome to Best in Faction,
the next generation, a podcast about playing 40K the right way.
I'm Tyler.
I'm Nick. And I'm Lucas.
And we are back with more Past the Pigs content. We are all very excited. I'm just kidding. Thank you all for tuning in for our April Fool's joke yesterday. We are here today to talk about something that is not quite as much of a joke, and I wish it were. Something that's been running through our heads for a while, and that is the topic of sportsmanship. This is something that is really important to everyone on this episode, on this show that we'll talk about later. It's important to everyone on the network. It's a founding principle of Best in Tabletop, and it's something that I feel like we end up having a couple of takes on that you may not see everywhere. There's been a lot of conversation in the community recently involving, not here to call anybody out, but there's been a lot of different takes on how to be playing this game correctly, and we figured this was about the right time for us to step in and give you all our 2 cents. This is, of course, just a starting point for a bigger discussion, and if you'd like to partake in that discussion, you can do so in the comments below. We'll be in there. If you'd like to join our Patreon-only Discord, we'll be in there as well. But we do have a lot to say, and we're excited to break it down for y'all, especially for some of y'all who may not have been to a lot of tournaments just yet, what the right demeanor is. But we'll get to all that later. There's a whole there's a whole kit and cadoodle to happen. But before we get into any of that, I got to check in with the boys. Haven't had a real show in a minute. How are you doing today, guys? How you doing, Lucas?
I'm doing great. The last week has been filled with a fair amount of 40K stuff for myself. Despite the fact that almost everyone was out of town here in Portland, we are in full swing in terms of the scrimmages that we're doing for Team USA, which is just really exciting to, I know, all 3 of us. I know we've kind of talked a fair bit about this in previous episodes, but all 3 of us are prospects for Team USA, which means that we're currently playing in scrimmages, we're associated with the team, and higher ups in the team leadership are like watching our tournament results to see how we do, which is really exciting. And then part of all that is playing scrimmages against other nations. So we've got a lot of scrimmages going on right now, which is very exciting. Nick and I both had a game earlier this morning, and I know you've got a game coming up as well soon, Tyler. But yeah, I played my game this morning against Greece, which was really fun. Got to play against a really great guy from over there. So had a ton of fun with that. And I'm thinking about the next scrimmage, which is already coming up in the following week or 2. So just super excited about that right now. Overall doing well. Not a whole lot to report. That's different than what I mentioned last week, but feeling pretty good about things. How about you, Nick? How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I had this past week off, and I was able to go home and visit family, who I haven't seen too much in a bit. So it was a fun week away. Got to go see my mom for her birthday, which was nice, and celebrate that with her. Also been playing in the 40K world, a lot of practice games. We had a really fun week last week. I guess 2 weeks ago at this point. We had I feel like we had people over like pretty much every other night playing games at our house, which was super fun. And as the year is ending and summer is coming, gonna have a lot more free time and looking forward to a lot more nights like those, especially with hopefully 10th ed rules. How are you doing, Tyler?
Dude, I am doing fan-freaking-tastic. I think this is our first episode since the 10th ed stuff dropped. And my gosh, I am so excited for all this new tiered nonsense. I'm sure everyone listening is already super aware of what's going on, but we're getting a whole bunch of new kits. It's going to be a real good time. So I'm very excited about that. Also been playing a lot of good games. GSC as a faction right now is kind of cracked wide open. There's a ton of different opportunities for innovation and more clever list design that I'm trying out, experimenting with a bunch of things. We'll talk more about that in the future. But I'm having a real good time, getting lots of good practice. Similarly, out visiting family this week, but looking forward to getting my boots back on the ground come Monday. Sweet. Well, with that all said and done, let's go ahead and jump right on in to our main topic today. We're going to try to move at a reasonable pace because we know this is a big topic. We've all got a lot to say about it, but we also want to, not drag on for too many hours. So here's a quick little outline that I've put together on what we're going to try to cover today. We're going to start off with a bit of a lighter about why sportsmanship matters. And then we're going to move on into one of our two main topics, which is in-game sportsmanship. And then we'll talk about out-of-game sportsmanship, and we'll define those terms as they come up. And then we're going to talk about some specific scenarios, talking through how to handle particular awkward moments as they may arise at a tournament. Now, it's worth mentioning, again, as a disclaimer, these are our personal thoughts here. We don't run the ITC. We don't run your tournaments. If there are specific rules about how to handle things in different places or whatnot, that's cool. Y'all can figure it out. This is how we think the game is supposed to be played. And that's about all we've got to talk about today. So, kicking it off, like I said, with why does sportsmanship matter? Nick, you want to get us started on this? Why did I call this in our announcements the most important part of the game? Why is this such a big deal?
Yeah, I mean, sportsmanship in my mind is you and your opponent it's kind of like you show up to the table. You're kind of both not verbally agreeing to play like a honest game where both players are going to play, their rules to their like extent of how they know. And also in some cases, like a verbal agreement between you and your opponent, like especially like throughout the game. And, we'll get into that. But sportsmanship really matters in 40K because like we're sitting down, we're having fun, we're playing this goofy game, and none of it really matters as soon as someone breaches that by like cheating or just kind of like making it not a fun experience to play, or just like not, really engaging with you. So I think sportsmanship really matters because it preserves the sanctity of the game that you're about to play with someone. You're about to sit down with, hour and a half to 3 hours, and without it, like, why are you even playing? So, we got anything to add to that? Yeah.
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head. It's important stuff. We're all sacrificing, some people are sacrificing more than others, but, we're all giving up time. We're all giving up money. We're all giving up. There's a large opportunity cost to attending Warhammer tournaments, right? There are other things we could be doing with our time and money and energy. And having a game ruined because of poor sportsmanship or someone misunderstanding how you're meaning to be playing the game is just a real drag for everyone involved. And so I honestly, sincerely doubt that we'll ever remove like all sportsmanship issues from the game of Warhammer. I mean, there are sportsmanship issues in some of the most established sports and like competitions in the world. It's not something that's ever going to completely go away, but to the extent that we can try to prevent it as much as possible, we should. So that's what we hope to do today, is just give y'all our 2 cents on how to prevent sportsmanship issues. Working through some scenarios on why this stuff is so important to think about and how to navigate those sticky situations, because it's never fun to have to deal with this stuff. But it's important to talk about nonetheless.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I don't have much to add on top of that. So let's jump right into it. First topic we're going to cover here is what I am calling in-game sportsmanship. Now, these are my terms. I'm sure that there's literature out there that uses different words in different ways. This is just what I'm going to be referencing for the duration of this show. When I talk about in-game sportsmanship, I'm talking about things that are happening at the table. These are both going to be at the table, but this is particularly as it pertains to the state of the game. Out-of-game sportsmanship is how it pertains to your interactions with your opponent, person to person, not so much player to player. I think these are both important topics. We'll talk about them both at length, but that's sort of what's going to tie this section together. Is we're talking about things here that change who gets how many points, what models are alive and what are not. That's in-game sportsmanship in my mind. So, Lucas, you want to run us through this first slide here and talk about playing by intent?
Definitely. Yeah. So playing by intent, intent is one of 40K's biggest buzzwords. It's something that you hear all the time. Everyone says that they like playing by intent, but that definitely varies. The actual implications of that definitely vary person by person as to what exactly is meant by that. So what does intent cover? I think all three of us could agree that intent covers a few different things. For example, measurements. So I might say to my opponent, I intend that I am more than 17 inches away from you, if my opponent's playing Death Guard, for example. And so that the intention obviously there is that you're a certain distance away so that, your opponent can't move and then charge you, or advance out and then get an angle on you and shoot you or something like that. So intent covers measurements. It also covers positioning relative to terrain. So you can say, my intent is to not touch this piece of terrain. And that obviously comes with a whole bunch of implications. You won't be benefiting from light cover if the terrain gives light cover. And you also won't be able to be shot through the piece of terrain if the piece of terrain is obscuring, that kind of thing. Intent also covers sequencing. So for example, one of the things that I like doing when I'm in the process of my charge phase is making it clear to my opponent where I'm going to be starting in my charge phase and where they might have opportunities to interrupt. So, as I'm moving the last of my models in, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to choose this unit to begin with and accept that you might interrupt in these other places so that there's no missing information or that kind of thing. So measurements, positioning, and sequencing are the three things that I believe intent covers. There might be some others as well, but those are kind of like the three biggest things under the blanket of intent. Anything to add, guys?
Yeah, particularly in the sequencing category, some other stuff that's on the slides of it that listeners may not see. Talking about things happening that have to happen at particular times, things that happen at the start or end of the phase. So, for example, it's very common to say, "Hey, this unit's going to show up over there, and they're gonna do an R&D. They're gonna do an action." Obviously, they don't do that right now. We're in the middle of the movement phase, but that's going to happen there. You understand the intention there. It's going to happen. The same goes with something like, for example, the Tau strike and fade, I think is a really good example of this. Hey, these Chrysler are going to move over here, and then they're going to strike and fade and move backwards. I'm telling you that now so that in my shooting phase, when I invariably completely forget to do that first and start lining up my Riptide to shoot over there, and I say, all right, cool, we're going to do this, and then say, oh my gosh, I need to strike and fade. That has to happen first. I explained to you that was the plan the entire time, right? 8, the goal of intention is to explain what's going on as transparently as possible so that there's never any assumption that you are trying to gain an unfair advantage by saying, this is what I'm trying to do. And then if I end up doing something that's not that, you can see what I was trying to do and we can make sure that it happens. Because this is a complicated game and it's easy to make mistakes. So I would add that there. Also, I would add on in the topic of positioning, one of the most common ones you'll see is people talking about distances from walls. I intend for this unit to be an inch off the wall so they can't be charged by your knight. Super common thing. Getting under a floor to fit in a measurement to make sure that you're an inch off the wall is a pain in the tail. Simply saying, I intend to be an inch off the wall and setting your models up quite close to that, particularly in WTC land where breachable isn't an issue there, I think is very the other benefit of intent here is not only in case you mess up, but it also saves a whole lot of time sometimes when you're trying to do something that might be incredibly technical. Cool. Anything else you wanted to add there, Nick?
Yeah, I think the time thing is a really important thing. A lot of people, complaints I hear about intent is people saying that it takes too long to communicate to their opponent or something, or they just want to move their models and pass. But it actually, in my opinion, just saves a lot of time because if you tell your opponent, hey, these guys are outside of charge range, they don't need to spend their turn being like, let's see how close we are. Or what's another good example? Shooting wise, if you go, hey, I'm going to go here. This is my maximum movement. I think that you can't see me. Could you mind showing me this guy moving 5 forward? Do you cut an angle here? You don't? Cool. On their turn, they know that they don't have to do that. And it's just a lot of stuff like that. Communicate with your opponent saves time. Helpful.
Yep. Moving on to what intent does not cover. So there's a lot of a lot of people in the 40k zeitgeist like talking about how everything in this game of 40k is played by intent, and we can all just use intent to cover everything. We are of the opinion that there are definitely some things that are not covered by intent. For example, things that are physically impossible. If the board state is such that you can't be both within 24 inches of a certain unit and within 18 inches of another unit, you can't be there, even if it is your intention to do so. You can't do things that are literally impossible based on the state of the board. Another thing that is not covered by intent, retroactive information. So advanced rolls, unsuccessful charges, anything that with some variability that might influence your decision-making process, those are not covered by intent because the information that you have has changed partway through. So what you're intending to do might change before you make the advance roll as opposed to after the advance roll. Another thing that's not covered by intent is things that are overly abstract. So for example, I intend to have screened you out is very different than these guardsmen are standing 9 inches away from the corner of my board in both corners, such that you cannot deep strike, that kind of thing. So that is one very, the first one that I said was very abstract. The second one offered some clear, consistent explanation as to why the state of the board is the way that I said it was. Another example for over abstraction is I intend to be where you can't get an angle on me. This is one of the ones that I run into the most. People that play shooting armies will probably run into this all the time, where it's like, I'm behind this wall. My goal here is to not be seen by you. Obviously, that can definitely be your goal, but if your opponent can just move and see you, then that's not covered by intent. You can't intend for something that's physically impossible to be true. Yeah.
For sure. Could you give us, I just wanted to offer a couple examples here. Something in like the retroactive information, for example. This is one that I see happen all the time, which is that let's say, hey, you've got a character, that's just super easy. Let's say you've got a captain behind a unit of Terminators, and your unit of Terminators is, barely within 6 inches at the moment. And you're going to say, all right, cool. They're going to go ahead and advance. Cool. They're moving up 11 inches. Oh, man. You're so excited. And you throw your Terminators up. And then your captain rolls his advance, and he rolls a 1. And he's stuck right where he's at. He's not getting anywhere. He's not getting within 6. Tough luck. You can spend a command point to replace that, but when you moved those models, you decided to accept the risk that you might not roll well, and you don't get to retroactively say, oh, I probably should have been smarter and trailed myself back, because we both know that if you had hit a good advance roll on your captain, you were leaving those Terminators as far out as possible. You don't get to use that information retroactively. One of the best things about the intention, though, when it comes to the physical possibility side of things, is when it comes to like really technical combat plays, something that I think you'll often see high-level players doing is they will discuss a play for a really long time to make sure that it is physically possible. And then they will just put models wherever and say, cool, that's what happens. And that is the right stage to have that conversation. Right. It is so much easier to decide that something is possible before moving a single model than it is after things are already messy and getting moved 2 or 3 times, especially in person. On TTS, you can rewind time sometimes if you really need to, but those are just a couple examples I wanted to bring up. Anything you wanted to add to that, Nick?
No, I think that's good. I think, just the biggest thing. We always kind of do a little joke where a joke line where we say something like my goal was to win the game, or my intention was to win the game. Like you can't do anything like that. Yeah. Intent is there so that you can communicate what is going on to your opponent, and also for you guys to like ask questions and like share information with each other. It's not there for you to like a really big thing like you're talking about, like these really cool combat plays you can pull off. Like in order to like do like the whole thing that people do where they're like, I'm gonna get closer to this guy who's also next to your character though, so I'll pile in away from your character. Like sometimes you need to roll like a good enough charge to even do that. That sort of thing. So sometimes when people just 100%. Like push their models and do it, it's like you got to measure it first and like let's talk about it first instead of you just assuming it's okay and doing it.
Absolutely. I think also something that we haven't mentioned yet is that while some of these abstract concepts are not appropriate as a declaration of intent, they are appropriate as questions. It's very reasonable to say, hey, have I screened you out? And then and I'll respond, what do you mean by that? And they say, can you deep strike in my deployment zone with that unit? That's totally a conversation we're having. It's a conversation we're having on your clock, to be clear. But that's information that I'm happy to provide you and I need to provide to you. It'd be really scummy of me to say, oh, I don't know. Maybe I can deep strike. Maybe I can't. We'll just have to find out. Like none of that. But to just say you cannot deep strike, we got to figure out if the models are in the right places, and we got to make that happen. I want to work with you on that as a team, You know, the goal is not the goal at the end of the day is to make sure that you're accomplishing what you're setting out to, as long as it's possible. That's the goal of intention.
I completely agree. Oh, I had something there and it just left, so it'll come back to me later.
Okay, cool.
I think one other thing before we move on to the next section. I think intent in general, it's like a conversation between you and your opponent, right? It's like an ongoing conversation in the game, like what Tyler was talking about, where if someone asks, could you like deep strike 9 away with this unit? And they go, I don't know. Can I? That's not okay. Like, it's kind of like an unwritten rule that you two are, a rule of sportsmanship that you two are going to be sharing as much information as possible. You don't have to tell them like, oh, my plan is to deep strike 9 there and then 9 there and then like 6 there with my GSC. So like, sorry, you didn't screen out that hole. You don't have to tell them that much. But if someone asks you a direct question, you should be giving them a direct answer. And I think also going into that, like the whole conversation with your opponent, one of my favorite things, and I think one of the most important things, the first thing you should be doing with every opponent is like the pregame discussion. And the pregame discussion to me is where you two show up, you go like, hello, nice to meet you. Like, this is the army that I'm playing. Have you played against this army before? Have you like seen like a list like this before? And going through what is in your list, what your army does. I often always do this kind of like, how much do you know? If they're like, I know nothing, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to explain like the very relevant stuff. Tell me if I'm talking too much. Tell me if I'm talking too little. During the game, if you need reminders at all, just ask questions. I think a lot of people are afraid to ask questions to their opponent, but part of intent is just like, it's information that should be given, as long as you can ask the right questions to your opponent. Like, don't ask vague things, ask direct things, and your opponent will respond to you. I haven't met many people that aren't willing to work with you on that.
Absolutely. Anthony Vanella, a good friend end of the show, brings up the bottom point that we have on the slide that we haven't covered yet, which is the difference between declared intent and implied intent. Everything we've talked about so far, I think, is very like, if you have different opinions than us on them, we've probably got some issues. This one, I think, can get a little bit more hazy. Anthony describes this as implied intent is good as, quote, obviously you didn't do this omega stupid thing. When I think about implied intent, I think about usually it's a question of measurements, right? It's when it comes to things like lookout, sir, or when it comes to things like what's another, or heroic interventions, where it's like, hey, these are small measurements, they're tight measurements. We're eyeballing these things here to make the game reasonable. But if I have, a very fragile character sitting on my home field objective, 3.01 inches away from a squad that would be providing him lookout, sir, to no benefit, the implied intention is that squad is providing him lookout, sir. And I think if I find my opponent in this situation, I think it's very unreasonable of me to be like, oh, sorry, you messed up. Your character's getting shot at right now. I understand, and if you come from a perspective that's going to see that differently, but I think that all three of us would in that situation give the person the implied intent there. Anthony brings up his additional examples, leaving a single pixel of a sword sticking out that you can fix by rotating, as long as you didn't just shoot with it, etc. Yeah. If I explain to you that I am trying to hide here, and you realize that I needed to turn my sword, turn your sword, dude. Like, this is we're not here for that.
Even if it's not clearly, sorry to interrupt you, Tyler. Even if it's not clearly implied, but like 8 dudes hiding behind a L-shaped building, crammed as close as they can in, you can obviously tell your opponent is trying to hide from you to the best of their ability. So if you can move the maximum of your movement and just barely see the corner of their model, you might want to say like, hey, by the way, I can just barely see you right there. Would you like to rotate? It's totally cool with me if you want to rotate your model so that I can't see you. Like, I understand what you're trying to do there. And the earlier you can do things like that so it doesn't get sticky later, the better, in my opinion.
100%. That one guy asks about a situation that I think comes up all the time, which is, I deep strike 5 dudes with jetpacks into the corner of the table, and they don't do anything for the duration of the turn. Is it implied that they were doing R&D? I did take R&D. I didn't do R&D anywhere else. Yeah, I think it absolutely is. I think there's a difference between that and a situation that I run into actually fairly often with GSC, which is oh my gosh, no one did R&D. I guess this unit could have done it. I wouldn't say that that's implied intent. And I think if your opponent is scrambling like that, you definitely do not owe them If you choose to say, oh, dude, you could have done it with that unit, just say it happened, that's great. You're being very noble, but that is by no means the expectation, I don't think.
I think that specific scenario is covered under bullet point 2. And I know we've already talked about this forever, so we can move on from this slide in a second. But I just want to talk about the retroactive information part of like a situation like that, where you don't actually declare who's doing R&D. I think it can be very clear based on the things your opponent is actually doing during the turn. Like in the situation of my 5 jetpack guys in the back corner are obviously there to get Rod because they're just sitting in the corner and doing nothing else with their lives but getting R&D. That seems very clear to me. What seems less clear to me is my opponent forgot to do R&D. Maybe things went pear-shaped during their turn, and all of a sudden they're valuing R&D in a certain quadrant much more than in another quadrant. That is retroactive information, and that definitely would not be covered under intent. You couldn't therefore go to like a quadrant where things are going horribly and say, my unit that's just barely in this quadrant is going to do R&D before things go horrible. That's not a decision you can make at the end of your turn. That's a decision you have to make at the end of your movement phase before you know that things have gone poorly in that quadrant.
Definitely. Cool. All right. And on the last thing that I think we have to talk about, I think is probably the best place to talk about it, is I consider there to be a massive implied intent around heroic intervention at all times. Unless your opponent specifically tells you that they are entering your heroic intervention range, the implied intent is that they are not in it. At all times. Heroic intervention is a conversation between you and your opponent in which you say, hey, if you make that charge like that, you're in heroic intervention range. Is that what you're trying to do? Because the implied intent is that they are not until they tell you otherwise. And if they say, oh, no, I don't want to do that, we check if there's a way to not do that. If you find yourself in a situation where it seems appropriate to you to say, oops, you moved 2.95 inches away from my character when you didn't want to get heroic. Sorry, you're getting heroic now. You're being an asshole. You just are. There's no way around that. And it drives me up a wall every time I see it. Even more so when you start talking about a 6-inch heroic intervention or some other level of shenaniganery. I am paranoid about heroics and ask about them constantly because as these things come up. And it is a massive bummer that not everyone's on the same page about this. But seriously, it's a conversation, not a gotcha. All right. I think we understand what intent is. Moving forward, speaking of gotchas, Nick, you want to talk to us about what gotchas are and whatnot?
Yeah. So just like intent, gotchas is another 40K buzzword that you've probably heard a number of times if you've listened or read about anything Warhammer 40K related. A gotcha is basically someone does something that you didn't know they could do. Either it be like some sort of stratagem, relic, warlord trait, ability, and it's one of these things. Usually it happens with implied intent. Like you were like, okay, so I'm gonna deep strike over here in R&D, and they go, surprise, I have an 18-inch Auspex, you're dead, idiot. And you're like, oh, okay. Or something like, okay, I'm going to another really good one is heroic interventions. Like, I'm gonna go charge this here. Okay, by the way, those like 5 little dwarf guys can heroic 3 for a CP, even though they're not a character. And you're like, wait, what? And then you get heroic and you lose the game. So gotchas are usually rare abilities that can flip it a certain turn. They can outright win games. And often the phrase that I hear as soon as someone has been gotcha'd is, okay, well, I absolutely would not have done that if I would have known you could have done that. And so talking about here, we're going to talk about how to avoid gotching your opponents, I guess how to avoid getting gotcha'd, kind of like what to do when you feel you've been gotcha'd, and then abiding by the golden rule yourself. We're going to talk about us getting gotcha'd and gotching other people. We don't like gotchas here. And we really want to ask the question, how would you feel if your opponent did this to you? Like if they surprised you with rules you weren't aware of? How would that make you feel? I talked about, the very beginning with sportsmanship. Sportsmanship is kind of like preserving the integrity of the game. If you're winning with a gotcha, you're not winning the game. You're taking advantage of someone's lack of information. If they're walking into a play knowing you can do this, like, oh yeah, I'm going to charge you in that building and you can make me fight last. That's fine. And then they lose the game because of that. That's on them. If they do that and they go, yeah, I'm going to go charge you here and wipe you out. And you're like, hey, guess what? You don't get to anymore. No one likes that. So, yeah, let's talk about gotchas.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Okay. The first thing to address here, I think, is how to avoid them in the first place, because the way that you avoid gotchas does not start in the middle of the game. It starts at the beginning of the game. And the way that you're avoiding that is that the intention is being communicated the entire game along, and you are informing your opponent of the rule that they don't know about as early up the chain as possible, right? When your opponent says, hey, I'm going to have this unit of Repentia, get out of the Rhino, they're going to move, they'll advance, they'll Miracle Dash charge, and they're going to go after that unit of Incubi over there. That's the moment that you say, do you remember, I don't even know what the Incubi thing is called anymore, but you remember they can make you fight last, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you have the conversation, as opposed to we've played an entire turn and now the Incubi are making you fight last, and you as the Sisters player feel awful because that was horrible and this was such an avoidable situation if you knew about this random rule that Incubi had that you didn't know about. So you tell your opponent what you're trying to do. Tormentors, thank you, Incuviolence. You tell your opponent what you're trying to do in advance, and that gives them the opportunity to tell you about it. I think that a lot of people end up in situations where they find themselves gotching someone because they didn't feel like they didn't know what their opponent was doing until it was way too late. So the sooner you tell your opponent what you're doing, the sooner they can tell you that you're doing something exceptionally stupid because you don't know something about it, and the less likely they are to have to gotcha you later. And also, if they then choose to gotcha you, the more reasonable you are or for being upset about it, wanting to have a conversation, as opposed to your opponent saying, well, when was I supposed to tell you about this? I assumed you knew.
Yeah, I really want to stress the importance of one of the things Tyler said there, which is make your opponent aware of the situation as early as possible. If they're doing something that you very plainly, if alarm bells are going off in your head, that's like, wow, that's a terrible idea for them to do that. You need to assess whether or not they're making a tactical mistake, which you don't necessarily need to correct them on. You can totally just let them do that. But if it's a question of they don't have information about your army, or they aren't aware of the abilities or some of the stratagems or relics you can use, that kind of thing, that's the thing you should warn them about immediately. So just to give example, because I feel like we should inundate our discussion over the course of the next little while with examples. One of the examples I had was during a practice game I had recently for Team USA, in which my opponent was like, maybe I should try to snipe out your war boss with my 5 Repentia. And immediately my brain went to, my war boss is toughness 7 and he's strength 6. I'm -1 damage and he's damage 2, and I have a 5 up feel no pain. So the likelihood that Repentia kill that war boss is like infinitesimally small. So I immediately said, hey, just so you know, the likelihood you're going to kill my war boss is very low for these reasons. And he said, oh yeah, you're totally right. I'm definitely not going to do that play. That was a situation that could have been considered a gotcha if I had just kept my mouth shut. And in those kind of similar scenarios, you should absolutely warn your opponent as soon as you can to when they start talking about a play they're going to make.
Yeah. I think this kind of goes back to that pregame discussion thing I was talking about with intent. A lot of times I will warn my opponent with main strats during it, like, hey, I have an Auspex. Hey, these guys can heroic. Hey, this guy can teleport turn 1, re-deep strike. And I'll even in what you guys are saying, warning them at relevant points, as they're deploying. Hey, by the way, I can deep strike into your DZ turn 1. Or as soon as they get to the reinforcement step, hey, watch where you're going to teleport in because 12-inch Auspex. Or after they go to their charge phase, hey, before you do your charges, or even in their movement phase, hey, I see you're close to me this turn. Those guys can heroic 3. Think about that before you start moving, or as you're falling back, or even reminding them again in the charge phase. I don't think that there's not reminding your opponent too much is not a bad thing until they tell you stop. Until they're like, hey, dude, I've heard it enough. Thank you. So remind them at the beginning, remind them throughout the game. In my opinion, at the beginning is not enough because there are so many things that you just barf at them at the beginning. If you're playing player place, you just had to set up terrain and you had to set up your army. If you're not playing player place, you probably played 3 turns of the game, and then the relevant weird niche strat comes up. So remind them as it's about to happen.
Yeah. As the relevant weird, usually off meta, but definitely not at this point in time player, it feels necessary to mention that this is more the case for people who play weird shit than for anyone else. I don't care how many weird things you have and how cool you feel using something that your opponent probably wasn't expecting. You need to tell them about it in advance, like every single time. And it doesn't matter if it's going to be relevant or not. The number of times that I remind people, oh, by the way, if you charge the Primus, the bike's can heroic 6 in any direction. No one knows that. No one needs to know that, but your opponent deserves to know that, because that stratagem is going to win you the game. It's going to be very silly, and your opponent is going to feel super bad about the fact that they lost to GSC, because who knows what GSC does, right? If you're trying to do weird, clever stuff, your opponent should know about it. Not necessarily know the way that the pieces all fit together. Oh, if a heroic there, I can use that strat to get over there, which will allow me to pile into these guys, which will allow me to do melee damage there, and then console out, do a different you don't have to explain the play. You just have to explain the tools. If your opponent doesn't see the 4D chess, that's fine. They probably won't. They probably won't see the 2D chess, frankly, but they should know what all your pieces are. This also goes for when people can't see stuff, like Welcome to Real Space, where models live behind walls and like human beings have line of sight. Hey, by the way, you walked right up. As a reminder, there's a melee unit behind the wall. Is a really easy thing to say to someone that can prevent a lot of awkward situations when they suddenly feel like their unit is fine because it's out of line of sight of your guns. The thing's right there.
Nice. Anyone else want to mention anything about gotchas?
What would you guys do? So we talked about how to avoid gotching people and what you should do to like prevent that. We talked about what a gotcha is. What do you do if you feel like you've been gotcha'd? Like that's a very awkward situation in the game. What do you think is the correct approach to dealing with that?
That is really difficult. I would probably gauge my response based on how severe it's going to be to the game state. I mean, if it's going to literally lose me the game because my opponent didn't give me a key piece of information that they like obviously chose to withhold from me, I'm personally someone who likes confronting folks more directly about that kind of thing. So I'm like, I would say, hey, I don't think you definitely should have warned me about that, and it would have completely changed the way I structured my turn. So do you mind if I do a take back there because you didn't give me the information? If it's not that big a deal, I would mention it but not ask for a take back. So depending on the severity, I would ask for a take back, but I would always try to make my opponent aware that they put me in an uncomfortable situation. Yeah, and I feel that's just because of who I am. I like, if my opponent does something that is a slight against me, I like putting throwing the hot potato to them and being like, well, now you can sit with that for a little while because you made me feel like shit. So you can deal with that for a little bit. That's just how I am, though. Either you guys approach these things differently?
Yeah, I think I end up being a lot more recessive. I don't have this happen to me very often because questions is just sort of my MO. But when it does happen, I think it's a lot of, hey, just to be clear, that's a really weird thing that I was not expecting at all, and that I don't think anyone would have seen coming who doesn't play your particular army. You're cool, like you did that happened, but please don't do that again. And if you see that me ending up in a similar situation, I'm going to get really mad about that. I generally don't find myself asking for takebacks in that situation as much as I find my opponents offering them when presented with that sort of information. I always feel really awkward asking for takebacks over weird stuff, like not over a lot of the things I was calling implied intent. Oh, do you put the guy on the objective, put him within lookouts range, stuff like that. That feels very reasonable to me. But being like, oh, I didn't realize something. Yeah, I have a propensity to learn some lessons the harder way that way. And it has, I can't think of games that it has cost me, but it has come very close to costing me some very big games in the past. And that's just sort of my personal preference. I really don't like conflict at a tournament setting. I'd rather back off.
Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of people in the comments here talking about how like if you didn't ask, it sucks. It can be a good learning lesson. Also, there's sometimes where it's like you can't go back far enough. Like if you are like in the middle of the charge phase and they're pulling off some crazy weird charge phase strat that might have messed up your whole turn, you can't go all the way back to the movement phase. That's a huge bummer. But it's just kind of like reasonably trying to figure out the best solution there. And I think really the best thing to do, like at least for me, how I try to avoid getting gotcha'd is that whole like discussing at the beginning of the game with my opponent. Like, hey, dude, here's all these weird strats I have. Like, I'm going to warn you as they come up. And then like doing that. And I find that people often respond in kind. They'll warn me. I had one awkward game in like the past season where it was an awkward game, an awkward moment in a game where someone told me something at the beginning of the game. 2 hours into the game, they pulled out this weird strat that I'd like never seen in my life. And I was like, oh, I had zero idea you could do that. And they said, well, you didn't because I told you 2 hours ago. And I said, well, I'm sorry. Do you mind if I just sequence this movement to avoid that? Right? Because obviously that's really dumb if I do this, right? Like, because you just get to do this for free and it turns this like move into a moot, like just a useless move. And they were like, well, then it's not a good stratagem because it's supposed to catch people off guard. Like you wouldn't warn someone if they like landed in your auspex, would you? And I'm like, actually I would, and I've been doing it all game with you. And they were like, oh, okay, I'll give you the take back here. You're right. And that was like because we had that like discussion beforehand and because of like my behavior, I felt that they were like, okay, you know what, you're like a pretty honest guy. You're not trying to take advantage of me here.
Yeah.
So
that is such a good point. The more goodwill you offer to your opponents, the more likely they are to respond to you in kind. And if you choose to play a very tight game and you're not willing to give your opponents a little bit of wiggle room, I know someone in this chat or in this call who has seen that go pretty poorly for their opponents when they suddenly are looking for grace they were not willing to provide to their opponent. Anyway, so there's gotchas. Cool. Lucas, I know you have a lot of thoughts on rules mistakes. How about you run us through this slide for us?
Sure. So rules mistakes, I would define these. I mean, it's fairly self-explanatory, but this is when you either play a rule related to your faction or a rule from the core rulebook incorrectly. So you misremember a statistic, you leave out some small part of a special rule that your units have, either to your benefit or detriment. That kind of thing. You forget which keywords a unit does or does not have, that kind of thing. It happens to everyone, right? Like the game is massively complicated, and there are, I mean, if we count every rule and characteristic and keyword, all of which have real implications on the game, there are millions and millions of rules in 40K, and it would be ludicrous to suggest that everyone could know all of them. So rules mistakes are going to happen. I've made them. I know you guys have made them as well. It's totally cool. Like it happens. Knowing all your rules is a difficult thing to do. So what is our expectation with rules knowledge? And what should be the punishment for making mistakes? So before we go on, let's tackle those two questions. What do you guys think the expectation for rules knowledge is? Say you roll up to a GT, like a 5-round GT. You're going to be playing 2 days of 40K with like the local people from your state or a couple states in your area. What's the expectation with the rules knowledge? What should all of the players know? And what should be the punishment for making mistakes? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'll go first. I mean, I think the expectation for rules knowledge, I expect when I show up to a game that my opponent knows the rules for their army. Especially like knows the rules for the things in their lists. Like if they're not playing, Rough Riders, okay, I couldn't give a shit if they knew anything about Rough Riders. But if they have them on their list, they better know what those do. Or like they better know what the relics and warlord traits do. And also just like in general, my expectation is like they, like we were saying, just like know how the game works. So yeah, but I think most important is knowing your army. Because that's what I don't know. I can help you out with the game. I can't help you out with your army as much as you can.
Yeah, I think that I don't know. I find myself surprised by how little it bothers me when my opponents don't know core rule stuff. Because usually when I say core rule stuff, I mean some weird niche core rule stuff. People are trying to use the fly keyword incorrectly. They're flying in the heroic intervention step or something. Or people, I believe it, Steve. Or people are People don't know how Lookout Sir works. Still, 2 editions into it working the way that it does. Like that's whatever. We can talk about that. We can hash it out. I can get you a judge if you need to talk to someone about it. But Nick totally hit the nail on the head when he said that I need you to know everything that I don't, or, and this is such a better version of that, I need you to be quick with the codex. And I don't mean necessarily that you're like well organized. I mean, you are quick to get out the rules and look it up. There is nothing more frustrating to me than someone who doesn't know their rules and refuses to look them up. It's one thing to be a newer player. It's one thing to be on a newer faction. It's another thing entirely to be convinced that you know everything about how your army works. And then when I say, oh, hey, can I read that? To say, oh, no, it's exactly like this. That drives me up a wall. I don't think that it's a big deal if you don't know your stuff, if you're willing to learn and you're willing to look stuff up.
Yeah, if there's even a shadow of a doubt in your head that the rule isn't played how you think it should be played, or I didn't phrase that correctly. If there's even a shadow of a doubt that you think you might be playing a rule incorrectly, or like the timing is a little bit off, you should get out your book and look it up. Either when your opponent prompts you, or when that thought comes into your own head. It should just be automatic, the first thing that you do.
And yeah, I mean, talking about expectation with rules knowledge, like my expectation is people know their stuff, but like in the reality, I don't expect everyone to know their stuff. And it doesn't mean that I don't trust people, but like if I'm looking to try to perform well in the game, I need to know my opponent's rules as well as they do. And luckily there's a lot of, good resources out there online where you can like look rules up, because especially it's like with like 30 stratagems per book, there's all these weird stratagems that have these like super like weird writers. So a lot of when I'll start asking people is like, can you do that engagement range? And they're like 100%. And then they look up their book and they're like, oh, first sentence says can't do an engagement range. Whoops. Thanks for telling me that. It's just, there's all these really weird restrictions. I'll double check. If someone's like, hey, how does that work? I'm like, dude, I've done this thing 100 times. Let me just pull up my book and we can look at it together. Solves a lot of weird problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the much harder question that Lucas has posed to us here is if so what there should be in terms of consequences for making rules mistakes. I know Cliff from StatCheck has very regularly made this argument that there should be common fouls in 40K, saying, hey, you have made a rules mistake. There is a very small but real penalty for that, and it will be enforced immediately. And I don't want to go down the path of discussing what that would be, but I think that the feeling behind that, what he's hoping to get out of the game, I'm with entirely, which is that we should not treat rules mistakes as if there is necessarily intention or not intention behind them. And I don't think we need to treat those things as being especially different if they have an effect on the outcome of the game. Doesn't matter whether you were trying to pull an over on me or you just didn't know the thing. I lost by 5 when I should have won by 8. That's huge.
Yep. If this is getting too far, let me know. But another weird thing is like, there's a lot of games I played where people make like minor mistakes, and I know their codex. It's like I played their codex in the past. Like I've read through the codex and websites and stuff. And I'm able to correct them on like 10 or 12 mistakes in the game, like minor things, but it's like, if those 10 or 12 things happen, like, I probably could have lost the game, or the game would have been a lot closer. Or like I could have lost points and lost standings, because a lot of tournaments are based on battle points. So it's like, at what point because like if you didn't correct it and they went on to win the game, you're entirely within your right to later be like, hey dude, like you messed that up. That's a whole different like sticky situation. But like sometimes in those situations, like the wins are reversed. Like if you can catch it before the next round. But it's like, if you correct it in the game and you like still go on to like still play, like what Tyler is saying, is that something that should be fouled if it didn't actually affect the game because you caught it? Or, should it still be fouled because they still made a mistake?
Yeah, I'm personally of the opinion that anything that's a rules mistake should be a foul, but also that fouls shouldn't be the biggest deal. Maybe a foul needs to be restructured to be more like a yellow card. I feel like a lot of judges are very reticent to give out yellow cards when, there's a reason that yellows are different than reds, right? A yellow is like, hey, you screwed up, try not to do that again, type of thing. Whereas red is like, you screwed up, here's your punishment, you're out of the tournament, or whatever it is. A yellow is not the end of the world. I've done things that should deserve a foul or a yellow card, right? I think a lot of us have. As an example, at the Best in Tabletop Open, I played, infamously, as no one will let me forget, I played my Orbital Gets Gretchen as being able to ride inside battle wagons when they definitely cannot. And it mattered for a few points against my game on stream against Anthony. And did it affect the outcome of the game? I really believe that it did not, and I think Anthony would agree with me. Should I have received a foul or a yellow card for that? Yeah, probably. I played a rule incorrectly. So I don't think that yellow cards need to be the biggest deal, and we're definitely not at that point right now where they still seem like they're this giant boogeyman where everyone's trying to avoid a card, and I don't think yellow cards need to be the biggest deal.
Yep. And that kind of leads directly to the next bullet point here is, should our expectations be any different for new players, right? Like, a new player is probably going to make more mistakes than someone who's played a lot. Should we hold them to the same standards? Obviously, we don't have a foul system or anything like that. Wow. Chat's popping up. It's impossible to cheat and pass the pigs.
We'll see about that. I think Luke will find a way. But I think that new players, in my mind, the distinction is less, are you a new player? And the distinction is more, what is your position in the tournament at the moment? If it is round 4 of a GT and we are both 3-0 and you are making rules mistakes, I don't care if you started playing Warhammer yesterday. You can't do that.
Yeah.
And you are going to be held to the same standard as everyone else. If we are playing round 3 and we're playing round 4 and we're both 1-2, yeah, we're chilling, man. Like, it's fine. You didn't know that. That's cool. If you want to learn about how that should have been done correctly, that's great. If you don't, whatever. That's where I come down to things. At least I give people a lot more slack if they're not doing especially well tournament wise. I'm not either, because I don't think that they need to be quite as tight. But if you're a new player in a winning position, I'm going to hold you to the same standards as everybody else. I'm going to try to be extra nice about it, but the standard is not going to change.
Yeah, I'd agree with you on that. You can kind of judge based off of like how the game is going and how the vibe is. But like, if you guys are both in a position to win, like, you should be playing correctly.
Mm-hmm. What about for players of newly released armies, guys? So say, what was the codex that was released somewhat recently?
World Leaders.
We're playing a game. Yeah, let's say World Eaters. We're playing against World Eaters, and there's some confusing keywords as to who can do heroics, who can do fight on death, who can do the plus one damage strat. Those all affect different units, not different units differently, but like some of them affect certain units, but not others. And there's some weird cross sections, Venn diagrams. What should we do in that kind of scenario if we're playing against someone who might not know their rules super correctly?
I think if you want to play the new hot stuff on the block, like, you should be held to an even higher standard. I mean, I hold you to the same standard, but like, you should there shouldn't be an excuse like, oh, sorry, dude, this army just came out 2 days ago. Like, I messed up. Like, you should read that thing, that codex forward and backwards, because I know even less about it than you do, probably, because those rules aren't available to me. Like, if a book's been out for like 3 months, I probably know what it does at that point. It's also, since there's a high correlation this edition between new codex and broken codex, you should know your rules. If you're going to go like 3 color minimum, like the most broken thing out there, and then slam it on the table and get half your rules wrong, you should get a red card. Like, sorry.
Completely agree. The more, and I think that goes even beyond, even beyond, new armies, and that sort of is another way of viewing the metric that I'm talking about here. It's not so much are you a newer player or a veteran player, so much as it is how hard are you competing. right? Are you showing up like, I'm going to give someone playing Imperial Fists a much longer leash than someone playing Iron Hands? That's just sort of the reality of the situation right now. And that's not just out of my own interest. That's also out of, I can tell that you're trying to get something different out of this tournament than I am, because we have to acknowledge that not everyone is there to win. They're just not. They can't all win. And a lot of people are a lot smarter than us and don't bother trying to focus on whatever brings them enjoyment. So you don't want to necessarily mess up someone's day too badly, especially if it's not going to change the outcome of a game.
Shall we? Next slide, lads. I feel like we covered rules mistakes pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I have to move the slides.
Indeed, you do. Why don't you take us through talkouts, Tyler? So,
sure.
What do we mean when we're talking about talkouts?
Yeah, so talking it out is something that I feel like was not as big on the scene until the last couple of years. And the basic idea is, instead of playing a game to its natural conclusion through the end of turn 5 and tallying up all the points, to say, okay, we're going to stop playing this game earlier than the natural conclusion for one reason or another. We'll get into it. And instead, we're just going to sort of have a conversation that sort of vaguely says, all right, well, what were you going to do next turn? Oh, you'd move over there. You'd shoot those things. You'd probably stand on that objective. Cool. You'd go stand over there. Gotcha. And we can just sort of rough out where the game is going to finish up. This has become incredibly common, and it is a plague. There are certain times when it is acceptable and certain times when it is not acceptable, and I think the latter outweigh the former. So I've got written here, it is acceptable to talk out a game basically in exactly one instance, which is one player has conceded because they are getting absolutely skull dragged, and they don't want to play out the end of the game. It's the bottom of turn 3 and they are tabled. Okay, cool. I don't want to sit through this and watch you move your models around. Obviously, you can go score your last 2 points of R&D. Let's go home, right? We can stop now. So it is a piece of sportsmanship that is available in like exactly that situation and almost none of the other ones. Let's talk about some of the other ones and why they're so bad. One moment. Excuse me. It is not acceptable to talk out a game if there is insufficient time to reach a natural conclusion. If you are playing on a clock and you have both clocked out, or you are not playing on a clock and the tournament organizer is calling dice down in 5 minutes, and it's turn 2, you do not get to score turns 3, 4, and 5. You just don't. You have mismanaged your resource. If you feel like your opponent has mismanaged their time resource more than you have, and you are being unjustly maligned, and you didn't play on a clock, that's on you, buddy. If you both used a clock and you both ran out of time, you both don't get to score any more than that. That's how it goes. Please refer to the specifics of the clock rules for how to score out games if one person clocks out and one doesn't. That's a totally different situation. It is insufficient. It is unacceptable to talk out a loss if the losing player will still be in contention for the tournament. This literally happened like last weekend, and everyone got really mad about it. I'm not going to be specific about it, but a player in an event in an early round ended up taking a loss and took a ludicrously high point loss from a talk out after resigning on like turn 2. And as a result of having so many more points than they probably should have, ended up making top cut because top cut was not all undefeateds. Horseshit. No, not at all. If you know that top cut is going to involve some people with a loss, we're not doing that. Alrighty. In addition, it is not acceptable to have a talk out if there is not a clear winner to the game, right? A talk out is hey, we can both see how this is going, and we're just not going to move the pieces, right? If one player is saying, yeah, I'll do this on turn 4 and this on turn 5 without any dice, I sort of assume that this, that, and the other thing die, and it looks like I win by 12. My gosh, would you look at that? I know I'm down 5 right now, but I'm going to win by 12. No, stop it. Stop it immediately. This is not acceptable. This is not Warhammer. Stop. Not acceptable. Okay. There's some examples. Do you guys have any other examples of when it would or would not be appropriate to talk out a game before we move into how to do a talk out if it becomes necessary?
One of my least favorite things is the last bullet point under the not acceptable category, which is one player tries to take over the post-game scoring. It needs to be a dialogue between the winner and the loser, and both of them need to be like very clear on who won and who lost, and then agree on everything that happened. And we'll get into a little bit more about how that agreement happens in just a sec when we talk about how to do a talk out correctly. But if one person is just dictating everything that's happening for the rest of the game that you guys are playing, that's not a talk out. That's just one person trying to get as many points as possible. And so that is absolutely not acceptable for one person to dictate the rest of how a non-existent game of Warhammer was played.
Yeah. When we talk about controlling plays, that is not what we are talking about.
So how do we do a talk out correctly? I would say the first thing is call a judge. Anytime a game needs to be talked out, a judge should be present, and the winner of the game, the loser of the game, and the judge should agree that everything that's going to be happening for the rest of the game actually could happen and is realistic. If it's not realistic, then, hopefully one of the three people at the table will see that as the case and call it out as such. And then someone wrote, do not offer handouts. Do they want to elaborate on that?
Yeah,
I don't know what that
I think
means.
I could elaborate on that too. I mean, unless Tyler wants to, since you wrote it. I mean, what I recommend. I mean, what this seems to me is like, say you won a game because someone conceded. Like you blew them off the face of the earth because it's like they deployed everything on the open and there's no terrain in your event, and you've tabled them in 2 turns, and they're like, I don't want to play this game anymore, man. I'm done. And you go, oh, okay. Well, if we kept playing, you probably would have scored like 60 more points. That's not great, because the issue with that is like, well, you might be relieved to be done with that game and be fine with the win. That person might be knocking other people out of the tournament. Like, if that person wants to continue to score more points, you should be like, okay, then we should keep playing. Like, I understand you're not having fun. I'm sorry. Like, if you want to score more points, you should keep playing for points, and we can do that. But I'm not just going to give you a high score because you want to walk away from this game. Another thing too is if you're in a situation where you are losing a game and you are you just okay, you're obviously going to win. Like it's, bottom of 4. Let's just talk out the last turn. And your opponent's like, okay, I think I score 30 points turn 5, really try to keep them honest. I know that sometimes you want to walk away from that and just be like, yes, fine, sure, whatever. And you can do that if you're really not having a great time. But you also have these judges available too. Or at least every event should have judges available too, right? You can call the judge and have them come over and be like, hey, dude, can you help deliberate this here? And they'll be a nice neutral third party, and they'll help really make sure your opponent gets an honest thing, because you don't want that opponent knocking other people out of the tournament as well. It's unfortunate because most of the tournaments we play are scored on battle points. And so every point matters, but it really sucks if someone else is trying really, really hard and then they get knocked out of top 8 because I don't know, some guy got in 100 when they should have actually gotten a 71.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's talk outs. Don't do them. Just avoid the situation entirely. But if it comes up, there's how to do it. All right. So just to check in on where we've been, where we're going. We've gotten through all of our topics of in-game sportsmanship. If you've got more questions about that, throw them in the comments. We're going to talk. We'll have time at the end. And we're going to move on now to our out-of-game sportsmanship. And this is where things are going to get a little bit more touch and go, if I had to guess. This is going to be a little more editorialized than some of the earlier stuff. And then we'll run through some specific scenarios and talk about how we want to do. And if you're still here in the chat at that point in time, we'd love to hear what you want to do in some of those scenarios as well. So moving on into out-of-game sportsmanship, which again, as a reminder, I'm defining here as things that are between us as people, not necessarily between us as players. These are things that aren't going to have an impact on the final score of the game. I mean, unless, I bully someone into conceding. That would be out-of-game sportsmanship, but it's still awful. But they are still things that are incredibly important. And honestly, I think most people think of this stuff before they think of the stuff we called in-game sportsmanship when we talk about sportsmanship. So without further ado, Lucas, walk us through what I've called here demeanor.
Yeah, so demeanor is more or less how you and your opponent are acting just as people while you're playing the game of 40K. The way you respond to events happening on the board and with the dice and just around you in the tournament hall, I would say. So demeanor, the first thing is, how do we deal with things going poorly? Warhammer is a game of chance. There's always the chance that the dice abandon you, something goes horrifically. and how do you respond to that kind of situation is a big part of your out of game sportsmanship. Yeah, dice, good dice and bad dice, that ties very, very closely in with the first thing. What do we do when our opponent makes a play that we didn't expect? So we talked about intent and gotchas, but making a play that someone doesn't expect, that's part of 40K, right? Sometimes your opponent can throw you through a loop and try something very original and creative, and it can surprise you. So what do we do when that happens? How do we respond in an appropriate manner? What do we do when our opponent does something that we didn't know they could do? That basically goes hand in hand with gotchas. How do we respond to that kind of situation? We don't have to touch on that as much, and it's not as related to demeanor, but I definitely wanted to list it again here. And then also, how do we deal with frustrated opponents? Like, this is a game that we all take, different degrees of seriousness, but a lot of us take it very seriously, especially I know us three do. So how do we deal with opponents that get frustrated by, maybe the game isn't going so well for them, or they have an unlucky break or that kind of thing? How do we respond in a way that's like professional and polite and shows some kindness, but also like doesn't jeopardize our likelihood of winning the game, that kind of thing? So yeah, how do you guys feel about demeanor? What do you guys what are some strategies you guys use when you come to the table and you're dealing with someone who might be frustrated, or you make a play that surprises them and they respond very defensively? How do you guys handle those kind of situations?
Yeah, I can talk about this first. Talking about like yourself, like this is the most classic definition of sportsmanship, right? Which is showing up, being kind to your opponent, being a good sport, right? This is stuff you hear about as like a kid and all that when you're playing sports. How do you deal with like things going poorly? I wouldn't lie and say that I've never like gotten upset in a game of 40K. Sometimes like you're really, really trying, like you're like about to win tournament, like you're 4-0 or something, and something goes poorly. Like your play was dumb. You recognize it turn 3. You forgot something. Your dice betray you. Whatever. The biggest thing, at least for me, is like you and your opponent, like entered this like social contract where you're like at the end of the day playing like a fun game between each other. You're there because you're having fun, and you like want to do well this game and everything, but it's still a game. And I think it's kind of like recognize like how you might be affecting the mood of your opponent, because I think we've all been on the flip side of that, where someone's having a really like bad like game into you, things are going really poorly for them, and they're not having fun, and it's real awkward when they're complaining the whole time, or just like down in the dumps. It can be tough. So like you don't need to sit there and be like, oh shucks, man, like yeah, you making 9 out of 10 5-up invulns was like super fun. You can be like, dang, that's a bummer. But you don't have to be like, that's the most horse shit I've ever seen in my life. Like don't get aggressive. Internalize it. If you need to take a break, like walk away from the table. Tell your opponent, hey man, I gotta take like a quick breather. So yeah, at least that's like how I deal with things going poorly. What about you, Tyler?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I had actually done, that I had an opponent say to me a couple times in a recent game that really I think was a great idea, and I'm going to start using this going forward, is if you find yourself getting salty, you find yourself getting irate, and it's clear that you're not holding it together as well as you'd like to be, because, I mean, if you can hold it together, that's great, but you can't always do that, is to make it very clear to your opponent what it is that you are upset about. My opponent said to me several times, you're wonderful, I'm really enjoying this game. I'm just, God, these dice, to try to separate it as much as possible so that you don't put your opponent in a situation where suddenly I'm, walking on eggshells trying to make sure that you're still having a good time. I can acknowledge, yeah, that dice was pretty bad. But, and Nick touched on this, and I want to drive this home as hard as I can. You are not required to be your opponent's therapist, right? They are responsible for handling their own emotions. It does not matter what additional complications they may be bringing in. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe something awful has happened to them. Maybe they struggle with it's some sort of mental health issue that makes them unlikely to be able to handle themselves. You are not required to handle their emotions for them. This is their responsibility, and if they are not able to do that, they should not be engaging in this hobby. That's the unfortunate reality of the situation. You are required to be courteous and to say, hey, if someone says, hey, I'm getting really heated, can I take a minute and walk and have a drink? Yeah, you are required to do that. You are required to not be a dick back to your opponent if they are being mean to you. But you are in no way required to commiserate or to say, oh my gosh, yes, this is all going so poorly because of the dice. That's what it is. Not your impeccably terrible movement. Not at all. This was completely don't. Just don't. I did this for so long and I'm so done with it because it doesn't help anyone. And I'm ranting now. So I'm gonna pull back. But handle your own stuff.
Anything you want to add about this, Lucas?
Yeah, for sure. One of the best strategies I've used recently is trying to. I'm saying this as someone who often struggles with getting very angry very quickly, which I know both Nick and Tyler have seen at the tabletop many times.
How many times have you had to reglue your mega knobs, Lucas?
Oh, a few too many than I'd like to admit. So frustration can come easily for myself, and I won't pretend to admit like I've solved the problem or anything like that. But one strategy that I've used and that I try to impart on others when they get frustrated is just saying what happened, acknowledge, as a way to acknowledge that it happened, and then immediately move on. So, like, for example, in a recent practice game against Guard, I was like getting super excited because it was a practice situation, and he's like, I want you to go first and put the pressure on me. And I'm like, okay, you got it. I know how to do that really well. I jumped straight toward him. I'm like, okay, everything I want to do this turn will be set up correctly if I make these 2 5-inch charges, and then they've got a couple of other risky ones. And the risky ones all made it, and then the 2 5-inch charges that I was really relying on both failed with Irigo. And I'm like, that is really irritating. That really frustrates me, and I'm really upset. And now that I've said that, I'm going to move on. So I find that strategy works really well. And this actually, this strategy was, I forget, I think it must have been in one of their podcasts, but I think Colin actually recommended this strategy of like, just say the thing that happened as like to help bring closure to yourself, acknowledge that it happened, and then move on right away. So like, darn, it sucks that I failed these 2 5-inch charges. Moving on, and you just don't talk about it again. So like, you don't try to pretend that it's not bothering you or anything like that, but you acknowledge that it happened. You acknowledge that it pissed you off. Your opponent gets to hear it, and then you immediately move on and don't bitch about it anymore. If that makes any sense. Does that make sense to you guys?
No, I agree. And I without spending too much time on this, like something I really enjoy doing is like you should be going to tournaments with friends if you have like friends available. It just really improves the tournament experience. But it also is helpful, like if you get upset, it's like someone you can vent to. You can be like, dude, this game was so dumb. I like failed 2 5-inch charges. And your friend will be like, that sucks, man. It's a lot better to go vent to your friend than vent to your opponent.
Nice.
Definitely. Something that I want to mention really quickly here. We talk a lot on the show about how important it is to not blame dice. I just want to mention that's a separate thing from not being mad at dice. I can be really upset that I lost it, that I rolled really poorly. It's not productive to think that that's what went wrong in that game as opposed to things under my control. You're going to get mad at dice. It's going to happen. If you don't get mad at dice ever, good for you, man. But it's much better to go in prepared for what to do when it happens and to just sort of expect that it's not gonna. Okay. Y'all ready to move on? Sweet. Up next, we've got dealing with challenging opponents here. We've got 2 questions here that I'm going to pitch out to the crowd, which are basically follow along that same in-game, out-game dichotomy. What do you do when you think you're being cheated? And then secondly, we'll get to what do you do when your opponent is a jerk. Let's focus on the first one though, because I think it's a little bit more straightforward. What do you do if you think you are actively being cheated against? You think that your opponent is being malicious and they are either using rules improperly, or they are hiding dice in shady ways, or they are lying to you about things, or they are taking back their words from earlier. What are we going to do about that? Because it's very rare, but it does happen.
Definitely a tough one. I think we might all have very different responses to this scenario, depending on our personalities and that kind of thing. So I'll happily go first. What I would do in that kind of situation, if my opponent I believe is being malicious, is just wait and try and confirm whether or not my suspicions are realistic. If the first thing, if they do something that leads me to believe that they're maliciously playing rules incorrectly against me, I would wait to see if it happens again. I'd wait to see if it happens in another place. Like, if they're cheating with the number of shots that their unit has in the shooting phase, I'll be like, I don't think they have that many shots. Let's look at your codex. Let's just confirm. Okay, we confirmed. Now we're in the fight phase. Your guys have too many attacks. Here's where I start questioning whether or not you're really being valid with all this kind of stuff. And I would go up to them directly and just say, like, you're playing your guys with too many shots, with too many attacks. You're playing your rules incorrectly. So, like, how are we gonna make sure that doesn't happen again? So I like confronting those kind of problems directly, because I find that for 80 to 90% of people who play rules incorrectly of their own volition, that solves the problem, because most bullies are cowards, or most cheaters are cowards, and they'll just back down immediately when you even give a hint that you're onto their bullshit. So usually I'll just try to confront them directly and just ask them how the hell they're getting the numbers they're getting. And without, if it feels uncomfortable to say, like, you're cheating, make it as clear as possible without saying those words, is kind of what I'm getting at. So, for example, what I said just a second ago, you're playing your guys with too many shots. It happened in the shooting phase and the fight phase, is a nice merry-go-round way, or, a nice way of circumventing the idea that you're cheating against me without actually saying those words, which carries a lot of, like, emotional implication. Like, someone might feel very attacked by that. And I want to try to avoid that if at all possible. Like, I still acknowledge that, anyway, moving on. But yeah, I would approach that situation very directly and try to make my opponent aware that I'm onto their antics without confronting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, it can be, at least for me, it can be tough to tell if someone is, like, purposely cheating or accidentally cheating. Like, are they just forgetting their rules? Are they just getting their rules wrong? Or are they, maliciously trying to gain an advantage? And kind of like what Lucas said, like, if they get, like, one rule wrong and then get a different wrong, and then they get a different rule wrong, but if they come back around to that first rule and get it wrong again, I'll kind of be like, hey, dude, like, we just did that, like, a bit ago. If it happens a lot during the game, I haven't had to do this, I think, in, like, forever. If it happens after, like, a lot during the game, I'll definitely go, like, find a judge and be like, hey, dude, this is happening a lot. How do you want me to proceed? Or after the game, I'll be like, hey, I don't know if that guy was maliciously cheating me or not, but they got these rules wrong multiple times. Please keep an eye on them so they don't, like, cheat someone else. And at least with our judges up here, like, I know Jason Bird is, like, real big on that. He's like, yeah, I'll keep an eye on it. And sometimes he's like, this person just doesn't know the rules. And, like, we just tell them at the start of the game, hey, dude, you need to know your rules better, and that sort of thing. But yeah, sometimes you won't have judges that do that. So that's just kind of the unfortunate thing. And that's when it can be awkward to confront someone. But I think the biggest thing is, you got your rules freely available. You can go look up your opponent's rules. If you really don't know a rule, just look at it and go, hey man, like, that rule's not right. And usually, like, oh, my bad, and they'll change it. And whether they are accidentally or maliciously cheating, like, solves the problem.
Definitely. I agree. And I want to double down on what Lucas had said earlier about how bullies are cowards, right? If someone is if you were worried that someone is trying to pull something on you, the sooner and the more strictly you can tell them that you're not going to be okay with that, the quicker it's not going to be an issue anymore. Something that we see a lot in this community is that there are people who are considered known bad actors, for lack of a better term. And these people often get away with stuff, and they have very high-level players vouch for them, in large part because they're not going to cheat against you once they respect you. And it's a bit of a bummer of a situation to say, hey, what you need to do is get them to respect you, but that oftentimes ends up being what it comes down to. Most cheaters don't think they can pull a fast one on someone who knows what they're talking about, and they recognize that the consequences could be very severe if they were found out, so they'll backpedal real quick. So if someone says, hey, yeah, that thing moves 10, and you're like, no, it definitely moves 8. And then the second time they do something, and they're like, yep, I'm going to go ahead and fire this, and you're like, you advanced. You cannot fire that weapon, right? People will back up. They will stop. And if you just say, I don't know, did you maybe, I don't, like, if you try to be wishy-washy about it, that's where people's charm and charisma can kind of take over a situation and they're going to make you feel like the bad guy for bringing it to their attention, be straightforward, be to the point, be direct about exactly what it is, right? What you don't want to do is be that guy who says on like turn 4, I feel like you're just doing something, like vaguely saying, oh, I feel like you're trying to get something off on me, like something about this isn't right. You want to be specific and clear and really to the point, to not give a lot of wiggle room for people to get around, because people who are doing this are slimy. They are, and they've been in this situation before more than you have, which is an unfortunate dichotomy or asymmetry. I mean,
something I want to point out here that Sam's saying in the comments is that he's saying he thinks it's worth mentioning how many times that all of us have actually been cheated, like in quotes. 99% of opponents are upfront or just a simple mistake. So I think it is important that we definitely say, we don't want people going into games. Like, you shouldn't be going into your games not trusting your opponent. You should be going into your games trusting your opponent. You shouldn't, the first time they make a rules mistake, be pouncing on it, being like, you were trying to cheat me right now. That's not how you should be doing that. That's poor sportsmanship. You can obviously gauge how your opponent's doing, but yeah, what Sam's saying here, I don't think I've actually I will say throughout the entire last 40K season, there was never a game where I felt like someone was maliciously cheating me. There was never a game where someone did something and I was like, I think you're cheating. A lot of the times it was that's a rules mistake. And they're like, whoops, my bad. And might happen a lot in some games and it gets annoying, but it's just them forgetting their rules. And sometimes you just got to be firm. Hey dude, you made that mistake earlier, but I've never had someone be rude to me. I've never had someone rolling dice behind a wall and hiding it, at least that I've seen. Someone might have been able to pull it on me, but yeah, there aren't people just going around blatantly cheating you. Most of the time, they're just making mistakes. So don't come in fist swinging. Give your opponent the benefit of the doubt. Kind of gauge the situation before you really bring it down.
Yes, I absolutely can second what Nick just said 100,000%. Be your own judge. Take into account what others are saying. I'll give an example in a second. Take into account what others are saying, but be your own judge at the table of the kind of person that you're dealing with. I'll give an example without mentioning any names. I have played against someone at recent events up here in the Northwest who definitely was playing a lot of rules incorrectly. Luckily, I only played against them once, but throughout the course of the tournament, I had multiple people who had played against this individual come up to me and say, you need to watch this person. They're playing all sorts of their rules incorrectly. And then another person came up to me and said, you need to watch this person. They manipulate the clock, and if you don't clock them, they'll take way more time than is, should be allotted to them. Half the time in the round is allotted to them, and they take way more than that. And then another person came up and said, I play this army. I know they're playing these rules incorrectly. And I said it to their face. And after the third person in a row, after the third round, came up to me and said to watch out for this individual, I was on super high alert. And so we let the TO know right away and that kind of thing. So when it came time for me to play this individual and I came up to the table, I left my clock at the apartment. And so I needed to borrow a clock from one of my friends. So I go over to Tyler or whatever, I forget whose clock I borrowed, but I take their clock, I go to the table, and when I set the clock down, my opponent says, oh, I see your friends or whoever, other people at the tournament have warned you about me. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'm immediately on guard from that because if this person's already defensive, that means that the fact that I merely just brought a clock to the table is already putting them on edge. I'm in for a rough game. So definitely be your own judge. I assumed that individual had pure intentions until I arrived at the table, and was immediately my suspicions were confirmed, and we ended up having a really miserable game where I had to correct him on this person on all sorts of stuff. But being your own judge is really important. Take what others say into account, but don't be your own judge of someone else's character at the game. And usually people's gut feelings about someone are the best thing to go off of. So as soon as I walked up the table and started deploying, and there was all sorts of hostility right off the bat, that's when I knew it was we were going to have a rough game, and I needed to be on high alert about this person.
Yeah, Definitely. Those situations are really awkward. And I definitely think this is one of the situations where the difference between being malicious and stupid just isn't really relevant from my perspective. If you're going to get a lot of things wrong, I'm going to hold you really tight, really, really short leash. It doesn't matter if you're doing it because you're trying to get one on me or because you don't know your rules. The response is the same, which is you're getting a tight leash. I'm double checking a lot of your stuff. You're rolling your dice in front of me. And I think that taking the judgment out of, oh, you're a bad person because you're a cheater, and making it more like, oh, you're a person who I am concerned about making a lot of mistakes. As long as I know what should be happening, just keep the leash tight, and it'll be fine. Something we haven't touched on yet that I think is worth mentioning here is what is the point in the game where you are calling a judge? That is something we have not mentioned like at all, other than in the talk out section. You're having a game that is not going fantastically. Your opponent is being challenging. When are you calling a judge, and what are you saying to them?
I think if sorry, I need to formulate my thought a little bit.
Yeah. For me, the only time I've had to call a judge for games is clock related. If they clocked out and they're throwing a fit. And that's just more like you got to have the judge come over and be like, hey, dude, here's how the clock rules work. And the judge will back you up, which has been kind of nice. Or it's because someone does a rule and I go, that's not how that rule works. And I show them on Wikipedia and they show me in their codex and we read it and they are like, your interpretation still doesn't make sense. And I go, cool, well, we'll call a judge over and they'll fix it. And that's like the only times I've ever had to like call judges over. So I think that's the thing. If you like pull up the rule and you're like, here's what it says, man. And they go, nah, that's not what that says. Call a third party over.
Yeah. Also, if your opponent responds in any other way other than like complete compliance to a request to like see their codex. So for example, in the example that I previously gave, there was one point in time where we needed to know the specifics of how like a certain revive mechanic worked in this individual's codex. And I said it worked some way, and then they said, no, it doesn't work that way. And I said, like, can I see your codex? Let's just confirm. And this person said, no, you don't believe me. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go get a judge then. He's going to make you look at your codex. And so, yeah, if your opponent is like not complying with your requests for like basic stuff, it's time to go get a judge right away because they're being a piece of shit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you're definitely right. It's about how compliant your opponent is willing to be with you pushing back on them if you don't think they're doing things quite right. A particular instance where I find a judge is often necessary is when opponents just sort of, I've had this happen a number of times, and it's one of the most frustrating things when they just sort of try to brush past you and move on with whatever they were doing. Like, oh yeah, whatever, shut up. I'm rolling my dice over here. Cool. He's advancing. Here's my charge. Here's this, that, the other thing. If it feels like your opponent is trying to sweep whatever you've brought to their attention under the rug, judge. Go get a judge. And also, one other thing I want to put here. If you are feeling uncomfortable in the situation, get a judge. Just do it. If you are in a situation where maybe your opponent is physically intimidating, right? A lot of dudes who play this game are like ex-military and they're huge. And a lot of people play this game are kids, right? If you find yourself in a situation where you don't feel able to talk up to your opponent and you feel like they're not treating you fairly, just go get a judge. Ask them to come watch the table. If your event has enough judges, they'll do it. And just having someone there on your side to advocate for you can go a really long way.
All right. Let's move on, yeah?
Yeah, indeed. I think everything we said about cheating applies to your opponent being a jerk just as well.
Yep. So this one here, you want me to talk about this?
Go for it, Nick.
So this is another good like out-of-game sportsmanship thing. It's what to do when you mess up, which can happen. So if you catch it in game, right, immediately see if there's a fix. Trying to think of good example here. I mean, like a good example could just be like I don't know, maybe you played a strat incorrectly. Oh shoot.
Yeah, like you realize is that there was a forest between you and the thing you were shooting
Yeah.
at right after they finish pulling casualties.
And then usually the fix in that situation is just let's re-roll everything, right? That's great. Also, communicating to your opponent what you did wrong. Determine if it affected the game state in a significant way. Like sometimes you're shooting, I don't know, 40 shots at a thing on 1 wound, and you're like, oh darn it, I was supposed to be hitting on 3s, not 2s. This would be like, nah, man, like it's dead regardless, whatever. If you don't catch it in game, like if you catch it after the game, you should discuss it with the TO. Especially if it affected the scoring in any relevant way of the game, especially if it affected the win versus the loss. Like if you scored 4 more points and you won 74-70, and you're like, oh, I should have actually scored 6 less that game, so I lose 70-68. You should go tell the TO as soon as you figure that out. You should not keep that to yourself. Because like, especially like if the next round hasn't started yet, you should go tell them, because it'll mess up the pairings, if you don't. Obviously it can be tough. Sometimes there's not a lot of breaks, especially between like round 2 and 3 or rounds 5 and 6. But if it's overnight or like between lunch, you can definitely go tell them. Another thing too that I've even seen is like people like playing stratagems incorrectly. Like maybe it's like I used it in all phases, but it's only the shooting phase, and they did that, I don't know, 4 out of 5 turns in the game. It's so hard to tell how that could have affected the game. It can be a huge bummer to be like, man, I won 96 to like 52. You should probably go talk to your opponent and be like, hey man, I messed this up. Like, I'm fine resigning. Like, let's go flip our scores, And that's a really messy thing too, because it's like that person didn't score that many points. Like, it messes up the pairings, but it's better to like be honest and like you're like, I didn't give you an honest game. Like the score doesn't reflect that. Yeah. What do you guys think about what to do when you mess up?
I would add on to that particular situation where you're like, oh man, I messed up, and I messed up big, and like that entire game could have been totally different. The move in that situation is not to go ask your opponent what to do. It is to go ask the TO what to do. And the reason for this is that what you absolutely do not want to ever find yourself doing is asking your opponent, hey, should I concede? Yeah. But that is never the situation you ever want to put your opponent in, because your opponent is left with 2 options. Either one, know that they were cheated, whether intentionally or not, and be really bummed about the fact that they're not going to be able to try to win this tournament anymore because of bullshit. Or 2, feel like they won the game because they convinced you to resign.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's not what I meant by like talking, but yeah.
No, you're totally right. I'm adding to what you said, not replacing anything you said. Everything you said was totally correct. But yeah, take that opportunity. Discuss it with the TO. If you explain the situation, the TO says that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, I want to leave it as it is. That's the TO's decision to make. And you can, of course, resign anyway. You probably should, but that's up to you at that point. But if the TO says that sounds like a big change, what do you want to do about it? What you're going to do about it is you're going to resign. Yeah. It's toy soldiers. It's not that deep. And you don't need to have someone, because you should tell them. They should find out what happened. And you don't want them to feel like they got screwed over. To what end? You don't need your internet points that badly, man. Go home.
Yeah, I'm of a little bit different mind than you guys on this. I changed the language on the slide from resign to consider resignation for that reason. I think it really is up to the TO at the end of the day. And I mean, really, if the mistake didn't impact, we talked about how important getting points is, especially because so many tournaments are battle point related when we went over the talking games out slide. And I get that, playing a rule incorrectly, even if it didn't change the win-loss outcome of the game, might have changed the points, and that matters a fair bit. But I don't think making a rules mistake warrants resigning from a game, either while it's happening or afterward. I feel like you can either fix the mistake while it happens, or tell your opponent about the mistake afterward and work to fix it and never make that mistake again. I feel like that is sufficient. You don't necessarily need to just every time you make a little mistake, throw that game in the trash and say like, oh, I don't deserve that win or anything like that. I'm personally not of that mind. So I think resigning is definitely for very niche scenarios where the mistake that you made actually had a big impact on the game state or the outcome of the game if the game is already finished.
I agree with you. I think if you can catch it in game, it's relatively easy to fix it. I think it's when your mistake has thrown the question of who wins or loses like up in the air. That's when you need to either consider like flipping the scores or just being like, I concede. If it's easy to figure out, like, oh, this one mistake was a 6-point difference, -6, you win, like your score is the same. That's easy to fix. Like the issue with Tyler and me at Atomic City Warzone, grudge match, right? I forgot that grudge match subtracted points from it. I beat you by what? 2, and then actually, -3, I lose by 1. I figured that out. We talked to the TO, we got it fixed. He just took 3 away from my score. It got it fixed before pairings went up, which was sick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't want to make it sound like I was getting a little too trigger happy there on the resignations. All of that is couched in the world of you made a mistake that was big enough that it makes the entire game in question, whether that be for a scoring reason or just a fundamental issue. But yeah, Tribble brings up an example. Our boy Tanner Herbert, really famously, was he playing into Steve when this happened with Mortarion? Yeah, he was playing into Steve. And what even was it? Did he give Mortarion more rerolls than he was supposed to have or something?
Yeah, he thought that the plague weapon
rerolls.
rerolls were rerolls to wound instead of rerolls to wound of 1.
Gotcha, yeah. And like that was a huge thing because Mortarion's in combat for like several turns, chopping stuff up, and the entire game comes down to Mortarion cutting through Steve's army. Yeah, probably the right move to say, oh, that was a fundamental misplay. I'm going to drop out. And he did, and that was really good on him for that.
Especially when Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that mistake was caught like several turns into the into the game.
It was after the game.
It couldn't really be reversed.
Yeah.
Tanner had already won. Tanner had beaten him by a little bit, and then they flipped the scores.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Tanner realized after the game, he's like,
that is a very clear case where resigning is the right call. Whereas like, if you made one mistake over the course of the game and it maybe was a 2-point swing that didn't impact whether or not you win or lose, don't resign because of that. That's dumb.
Oh yeah. Yeah, 100%. I think this slide is not quite as clear, I think, in part because it's been slightly censored. Part of the intention behind saying when you had effed up in the first place was that I'm talking about real big mistakes here. If you made a small mistake, great to let your opponent know, hey, by the way, I did this a little bit wrong. I don't think it affects the game. But like next time you play into someone, this is going to happen. Because one of the worst feelings as a player is when you play into a faction that you've played before and they play a rule like less strong than you were used to having it played against you. And you're like, wait, that's how that works? And they look it up and they're right. You're like, are you kidding me? And suddenly you're really mad about something because they never told you. Tell your opponents when you've made small mistakes. Resign when you've made big mistakes. Mm-hmm. Cool. Okay. I think that brings us into, unless there's anything else y'all want to say before moving to some situations. Cool. Nope. All right. Welcome to our, we haven't done a man versus matchup in too long, so I had to build a new thumbnail called man versus awkward situation. Sorry to kind of throw your avatar under the bus here, Nick. The red and yellow cards, they're not for you. You're great.
That's me, dude. The king of awkward situations.
No, I was going to go with red card Nick.
Yeah. Why do you think there's a band right down the middle of his head? They just stapled it to his face. Yeah,
exactly.
Right. Anyway, check us out on YouTube if you want to see all the visuals. If you're listening on the podcast, anyway. So here's a couple situations. Some of these have actually kind of already been covered, and we'll breeze through them. But if you're watching us live, feel free to answer what you would do in any of these situations in the comments, in addition to what we've got here, and we'll try and have a little conversation here. So. Here's the first situation, and Lucas said that this had happened to him exactly, but I think it'll be interesting to talk about in some broader contexts. First situation is you pair into someone you've never met, but your friend tells you that he's a bad actor. Now, this can range all the way from someone that you know about who wins a lot of tournaments to someone who your friend just played into who beat them. It happens at all sorts of different scales, but how do we think that we're going to approach this situation that is both kind and graceful, but also acknowledges the potential reality of what's going to happen?
Thanks, Kim.
I Lucas already regret audience participation.
Yeah, Lucas already talked about this a lot, so I think I'm going to bring in my own 2 cents. Yeah, definitely. Like if someone comes and warns me, or if like multiple of my friends come and warn me, first off, if it's about like certain rules, I'm gonna like make sure to read up on those rules. I'm probably gonna like make sure to double check like the codex. I'm gonna make sure to have the codex like handy on me. Also, I think like going and making a judge aware of the situation. If your friends are like, yeah, dude, you gotta watch out for this guy, and you're like, well, have you told the TO? And they're like, nah, man, like you and I versus the world. Like, don't do that. Go talk to the TO. Be like, all right, hey, Mr. Hey, TO, like my friend just ran into this situation here. I'm about to play into this person. Would you mind like just like kind of a heads up? Some stuff like I might be coming to you with questions, or I might be coming to you to come like watch our game. Is that okay? Just so that they're aware. Also, too, like if you play someone where something happens like that, you should tell the TO so that the TO is aware of it. So, because like someone might not have a friend to warn them that they're about to play someone who's going to try to pull one over on them. But yeah, go in with wariness. Don't go in like ready to like put up like throw fists until the person's like really pushing back on you, and get the TO in your corner. I'm pretty sure most TOs would be like, if you guys are like off fighting like your own like fight against cheaters, and I find out about it halfway through the game, there's not a lot I can do. Like if they know from the beginning, they can like be a lot more involved, and they're going to be a lot more in your corner than if you come in like irate about something that's happening. What are you, Tyler? What would you do in this situation?
I'm with you on that. I would add to definitely walk in with as much benefit of the doubt as you can muster for this person. It's possible that your friend just had a really bad game into them, or they've ended up in some awkward situations, but they're on the up and up now. If you walk into a game and like literally say to your opponent, hey, I've heard a bunch of shit about you. I bet you're a bad person. How the hell are you giving them an opportunity to give you a good game? That's going to be miserable from the start, right? It's sort of the inverse of what Lucas was saying about he puts a clock on the table and his opponent goes, oh, I bet you're real scared of me. I'm a real sack of potatoes. Like, no, that is going to end up really awkward. So give people the opportunity to do things well. And then when they choose to exploit that opportunity, tighten the leash as hard as necessary. And yeah, like Nick said, get yourself a TO, get stuff going in advance. TOs absolutely hate it when you come complaining to them at the end of a day saying this person gave 3 different people awful games. He was yelling at them and cheating and all this bad stuff. And they're like, well, why didn't you tell me? We could have kicked him out hours ago, right? Why are you subjecting later players to that terrible experience? We had this happen at a recent tournament. Someone got thrown out because someone complained. It's the right thing to do. Talk to your TO about it before, during, and after.
Yep. Lucas, anything you wanted to add? I know you talked about this a lot earlier in your actual example, but
for sure. Yeah, I'll just give another example of the opposite case where I don't feel bad about name dropping this person because he's like one of the best known people in our community for better or for ill. I played against at last LVO in round 5. I played against TJ Lanigan, who obviously has a well-known history in the 40K community of doing some shady stuff. And I was super duper nervous about it because it was like one of my first big tournaments, and I was just terrified about playing this individual. And TJ and I had like a super amazing game, and I realized he was just totally the most chill person ever. And that was because I went into the game, gave him the benefit of the doubt, decided we just play it out and have as much fun as we could. And lo and behold, it was a really awesome game. He was a really awesome opponent, and we're like still great friends. So much so that I flew across the country to hang out with him and Anthony and do a practice weekend for the following LBO. So I think giving your opponent the benefit of the doubt is a great takeaway from this discussion. Don't let others' experiences color your experience before you've actually been exposed to it yourself. If you've been warned about someone, you go into the game and they're being a piece of shit to you, yeah, double down and no mercy for that person. If you've been warned about someone, you go into it and they end up being a pretty chill dude and you have a nice time, great. You don't need to worry about them in the future.
Sweet. Let's move on down to scenario number 2. Only person who jumped in with legitimate recommendations other than throwing drinks in people's faces. Sam says essentially what we said as well. Give them the benefit of the doubt, but be on high alert. Cool. Up next, this is one that I think we have all run into a lot, and it is something that we haven't touched on at all yet today, which is what do you do when you find that your opponent is playing exceptionally sloppy, Lucas, what am I talking about when I say that your opponent's playing sloppy? What does that mean? And then how would you try to deal with it?
Oh man, one of my least favorite things is sloppy play. So just to give a couple examples of what exceptionally sloppy play might look like. The classic offender is moving vehicles and monsters around ruins. If your opponent is teleporting their vehicle through a wall, that's sloppy play, and that should not be allowed. So to kind of give some context for what I mean here, we obviously have the breachable keyword in 40k, which means that only infantry, beasts, and swarms can go through walls. So if your armiger is hiding behind an L, for it to go around the L, it will have to come back, go around, get a clear line forward, and then go down that line. You can't like just loop around the shortest path possible and go, because obviously the armiger has a size to its base. That's an example of sloppy play if your opponent doesn't decide to measure that full distance around. Another example of sloppy play might be, quickly making a measurement and then immediately moving before your opponent has a chance to like verify the measurement if it's going to be a close distance or something like that. Or, picking up the tape measure and then just teleporting your guys across the field. That I think would be sloppy play. Nick gives another example. People not piling in or consolidating correctly is common sloppy play. I would agree for the most part. I think that, if your opponent like forgets or you forget to pile in or consolidate, and then after you've made your attacks, you're like, shoot, you mind if I do this small pile in move just so that I can hop onto the objective like I hope to? I think most opponents, 90% of opponents would be like, yeah, that's totally fine. I would say that, yeah, that's sloppy play, but I wouldn't say it's exceptionally sloppy play because it's pretty obvious what you intended to do there. Others might have different opinions, but
some blind intention.
The consolidates are great examples. What other any other examples of sloppy play you guys can think of?
People just
get real. No. Go for it.
Like when people aren't talking about intent, like they just like kind of shove their guys up to a building and like touch the building, and then you get to your turn and you go, I'm going to shoot you, and they go, oh, my intention wasn't to be there. And it's like, well, you put your models like on top of the building, man. Like this is a very awkward situation, which we could have avoided either with you moving correctly or talking to me about intention, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I think that line of sight is something that gets very sloppy sometimes, especially when it requires true line of sight. It's very easy to think that everything is just sort of these abstract, two-dimensional, there's ruins and there's nothing else. And suddenly someone's trying to draw a line of sight through like two rhinos and a building. And you're like, wait, what? Try again? Or people hand wave sequencing and stuff like that can be an example of fairly sloppy stuff. But yeah, it's generally trying to rely on intent for things without actually having them be possible, like we talked earlier, or without actually making the measurements to make sure that it works quite the way that they'd like it to. So yeah, your opponent is doing a lot of this stuff. It happens. There are players out there who are not especially technical. What are you going to do about it, Nick?
Yeah. The thing is, like, this is like a really awkward one because you sometimes don't know like the vibe of how the game is going to go at the start. But like, say for example, turn one, you play against like a Knights player and their Knight goes 13 inches forward through the building. Like I've seen a lot of people do this where they clip the building and you're like, and so it's really awkward. But like, I'm sometimes like, hey man, you got to go around the building. Like that's not how that movement works. And a lot of people are confused. Like I was confused when I first learned about this, when I first started playing like big ground vehicles, because I was used to playing Necrons where all my vehicles had fly. So I didn't have to worry about all this. And Lucas was like, Nick, this is how you move like an orc buggy. Like, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So yeah, it helps a lot. Like if you go first and get to show them, but, yeah, I'll tell them, but like, not like it's like, try to do it in like a nice way. Obviously be like, hey man, you can't do that. I'm really sorry. Like you actually have to do this. And usually people are like, oh yeah, sounds good. So like, don't be rude. If someone's like real ignorant of it, like you definitely like be a lot more stern. Like, no, you are not allowed to do that. I'm sorry. Like you were going here and here and here. You're ending up here, not 12 inches forward. Yeah. And then also just like reminding them too, like if it's especially like their stuff's kind of like out of the way, or like if they touch a wall, like I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They're like, they touch a wall, obviously, it's kind of like implied intention. Like, oh, I wasn't meant to touch there. Okay, man, that makes sense that your like cultists aren't going to get exposed to my shots. please try to be better about that and just tell me. And they'll usually be like, oh yeah, I'll let you know. Like, you got to remind them. And then the last one, talking about, I lost it. Yeah, let's move on to Lucas.
Yeah, I remember I remember now one of the things that irritates me most about sloppy play, or one of the examples, and that is models moving way too far, especially when it matters. So, for example, I go to do a 6-inch charge or something like that, and I roll an 11 or something like that. A lot of folks are really good about measuring the first model and being very precise about that, and then every other model thereafter just kind of like goes wherever it wants to, approximately 11 inches. I think that kind of scenario is okay if the thing you're trying to do is just kill the enemy unit. Like, just move up as far as you can, get all your attacks in, and kill them. Then you don't need to be very precise about moving literally every single model one at a time, moving at exactly the same inch. If your goal is just to move forward 6 inches and kill the enemy unit, you don't have to hold your tape measure out for literally every single model. But if you're doing some kind of complicated maneuver to like get closer to X model and then closer to Y model so you can get in onto this objective, you should be measuring that 11-inch charge with every single model and showing your opponent how it's all happening. You shouldn't be moving the first guy 6 inches and then moving the other guys wherever the hell you want to. That is sloppy play. So I think there's a little bit of ambiguity there, obviously. Like I said, if your goal is just to like do X, then I would communicate that with your opponent. Say, my goal is just to like kill your unit here, so I'm just not going to be super precise about these movements. I'm going to move. I rolled an 11-inch charge. I'm going to move between 8 and 9 inches. Bleh. There we go. But if your intention is to like move around and kill the unit with something else and then do a weird pile-in maneuver, you should be precise about that movement. If my opponent is being sloppy with that kind of thing, I would just straight up say, you moved way further than 11 inches. Before we go any further, the rest of your unit is still there. Let's put that model back and see where 11 inches actually is. That's how I'd solve that situation. And usually when shown evidence of them doing something wrong, most opponents will back down and say, oh yeah, sorry, my bad. I did that incorrectly.
Definitely. I would agree with that. One other place that I think that people get sloppy that I think we haven't mentioned yet is with transports. People can be very quick to say, okay, cool. So my unit gets out 3, moves 6, and I roll in advance. Cool, an extra 4. So I'm just going to measure 13 from the tip of my transport and then light up a bunch of dudes on that line.
That infuriates me.
And to a lot of people, you may be saying, why? I get out 3, I move 6, I advance 4. What does it matter? And it matters for 2 reasons. One of those, which are kind of the same reason, which is that there's a stop in the middle of that. You get out 3 and then you stop. And then from there, you move maybe 6 plus an additional 4. And what that means is, first of all, you probably can't fit all of your models in a big line within 3 right up against the front. They're probably wrapped in some weird L-shaped pattern with this 10-man squad where the back dudes are like 6 inches further back than you'd otherwise want them to be. And second of all, they might not necessarily be able to be in a position to make that straight cut like that, right? There may be a wall next to your transport. Surprise, they have to get out around the back. Or they have to stay outside of an engagement range in a careful position. There are too many scenarios where it gets messy, and the correct way to avoid this situation is to just always get them out and then move them. Don't do it in a fell swoop. It's a bad idea.
Same thing with disembarking your models from a destroyed transport.
Yes.
In the majority of cases, I will say it doesn't really matter. You can like roll the dice, then go to your case, get the models that survived, and put them on the table. 90% of the time, that's fine. But if there's any kind of situation where the quality of your rolling 10 dudes getting out of the transport, the quality of that roll, how many ones you roll, if that impacts your decision after where those models go, you should place those models first in the correct spot, then roll the dice, then remove your transport and the models that died. That's the correct way to do things. And I think that playing, not doing it that way in a situation where it matters, it should be considered playing sloppy.
It absolutely is. Also, just as a quick reminder for anyone, because I feel like people forget this a lot, you get your dudes out, as many as you can fit out. Anyone who doesn't get out dies, and then you roll the dice for whoever's left.
Mm-hmm.
You do not get to say, oh, 3 guys died. Cool. Well, I had 10 dudes in there and only 7 of them fit anyway. So there's my 7 dudes. 3 guys die after the guy died on the way out. Anyway. So yeah, those are some additional examples of sloppy play. And yeah, I agree that it is probably the most awkward conversation to have, because when there's a rules issue, I can point to a book and say, it says right there, that doesn't work because you're within 6 inches. You got to be outside of 6, right? When there's hey, you definitely moved that thing too far, and your opponent says, nuh-uh, and they put it back where they say it started, and it definitely didn't start there, and you just, it's horrible. So you do your best. Mm-hmm.
Like, it can feel awkward. Like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm an ass when someone like ends their stuff within my engagement range, and I'm like, hey man, I know it's just an inch, but you're in a combat with my model now, which you're not allowed to do. And they'll be like, it's just an inch. And it's like, yeah, but it might matter. And then lo and behold, when it gets to the charge phase, it matters. They're an inch short from stealing the objective or something. Like, like what Nick said here, like, never feel bad for asking people to play by the rules. It can feel like a bunch of small stuff, but like, you know, you gotta hold people to an honest game. But like, you don't need to be rude about it.
Definitely. So cool. All right, let's move on forward. This is one that this drives me up a wall. A judge rules not in your favor, and you know that judge is wrong. You know they're wrong. We can throw a couple judges under the bus here. We love them. But I don't know. There's a couple of instances that jump to mind to me of like, are you freaking kidding me? Nick can probably mention the most famous of them, in our group at least.
Yeah, I've had this happen to me at 2 notable occasions. I think where this is relevant, like when the situation happens, this really applies to like out of game and both in game, obviously. Like out of game, you need to like, this can definitely affect your demeanor. It can be like what Tyler just said, infuriating when you know the rule's incorrect. But the judge, who is like the final rule stop at that tournament, rules differently. And now you're playing the game in a different way, but like in the way that it's going to be played at the tournament. And that can be annoying. You just got to not like, obviously let it tilt you. There's not a lot you can do, unfortunately, because the judge is the final person. You could maybe get another judge. I had one tournament where like a volunteer ruled, and I'm like, are you the tournament organizer? And they're like, no, that's the TO. And I'm like, hi, can we like get the TO? And the TO ruled the right rule. And I'm like, okay, thank you. But if it's like someone like a, official judge shirt, it's probably going to be law. Tyler's talking about the most famous example was when someone heroic intervened with fly. I basically was like, hey, my intention here is to be outside of heroic intervention because I have an intervening model. You can't go over me and you can't heroic into this. You're going to heroic into the thing next to you instead. And the guy, or you're going to heroic this way instead, basically. Yeah. Which, if you look at the rules of fly, it, says when you make like a normal move, advance, fall back, it doesn't say like it lets you, or charge, lets you move her models, but not heroic intervention. That's a different thing. And the judge, my opponent was like, oh, I didn't realize that's a rule. Like, do you mind showing me the rule book? And I did. And I'm like, yeah. And the judge came over and was like, yeah, I know that's in the rule book that says there, but it's kind of a gray area. So we're letting it happen. And I'm like, luckily I asked my opponent, I'm like, so my goal was to stay outside of heroic. Do you mind if I just adjust where these models are so like this guy doesn't get heroic? And he's like, oh yeah, you like 100% could have done that. Now that we know that this is how the game is being played, go ahead and do that. And so that's what's nice. But yeah, I mean, this is like a tough situation because it's like a lot of the times like unsalvageable. It's kind of like at that point you got to like hope your opponent's kind enough to let you like take back, and that's where like communication's really good. Comes all the way back to intent. If it was possible, you can hopefully like salvage the situation here. What would you guys do? What would you do if this happened to you?
I, for one, I definitely think of this as this is an out-of-game sportsmanship question, not an in-game sportsmanship question. For me, at least, because I don't have a choice of the matter in-game. If the judge tells you one way and you proceed to play it the other way, you're cheating. You just are. So you need to not do that. There's totally a reasonable world where you say, hey, the judge is wrong about this. Can you see why the judge is wrong about this? And your opponent says, yeah, no, you're good. Keep doing the thing you're doing. I'm not going to heroic like that. That would not be allowed. That's great. But that's not the reality of the situation 9 times out of 10. So it is a question of letting go and of not internalizing that. And then, and personally, and I'm horrible, I would probably write up an email to that judge later on, explain to them the case in a lot more detail, why it works the way that it works, talk to them or write to them or Discord them or whatever, just to make sure that that doesn't happen to anyone else again, because that rule is important. I've had this happen around dense cover before. A lot of judges seem to think that if you can't draw a line of sight, you can't count as drawing lines to avoid dense. That's just not the case. You don't need line of sight for that. So that often I file, but the point is though, in game, I file in my head, okay, I can have that conversation later, but that's not relevant now. And now that I've given myself a place to put that emotion, I filed it away into, we will deal with this later. Now I can devote my focus back to the game, and that's how we actually move forward.
Yeah, dude, when the judge gotchas you, it feels bad. Lucas, do you have anything to add? What you think you would do if you encounter the situation?
Not really. I've had very few encounters with judges in this manner, so I think y'all nailed it. I'll leave it there.
Yep. And like what Sam points out here, just like, in sports, in 40K, when a judge makes a call, you can't really change their, mind or point of view, and you got to accept it. Just got to not let it tilt you and accept that's the new reality of the game. Hopefully your opponent lets you fix things. Move on from there.
Alrighty. Moving on to, I think this is our last slide here. We talked about this earlier on, but I think we're going to talk about it in a slightly more charitable way now. Not so much that dice are involved or your opponent is mad about something crazy, but you're winning a game by a wide margin. You are outplaying your opponent. It's clear that there's a skill difference here. They're losing real bad, and they are making it clear that they are not having a good time, that this is not the experience that they signed up for, and they are really upset about having to play into you because your army is super broken, or, you're just stomping on them. How do you handle this situation with grace to avoid being an asshole, basically?
I might have a very different take than you guys on this, so I'll let some of y'all go first. I'm not gonna lie.
Okay. Yeah, for me, the meta chasing whore that I am, I have encountered the situation a few times. So, I always try to like approach the game from a very cheery perspective and like try to make it like aware that I'm not trying to pull one over on someone. And I think people hopefully recognize that when they're like, yeah, like you've been communicating everything this game. Yeah, I know your army can do that, but it's still stupid. Like, and I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry, and I sympathize with them. And like, I think earlier Sam was talking about in the chat, like, do you like celebrate when people's dice rolls go well? Like, yeah, like if someone like does something sick to me or like when my vehicles explode, they're like, I got you. As long as they're not rude about it. If they're like, screw you, I'm like, dude, that's not nice. But if they're like, oh, I did it, I'm like, nice work, that sort of thing. And also like at the start of a game too, I'll like usually be like, hey, like, do you want me to buy you a drink? And especially like if halfway through the game someone's not having a good time, I'm like, hey man, I'm gonna like go get some like, it's a drink real quick, like a snack. Do you want anything? Like, let me know. Just to try to like diffuse the situation. Obviously, there's sometimes where your opponent goes too far and they're just rude. And that's when you kind of gotta be like, hey man, like you're being really rude. I'm not having a good time. And if they really are like not willing to work with you, you gotta be like, okay, dude, like we're just gonna end this game. Like foot on the gas. Like I'm gonna explain everything to you as it's happening. I'm not gonna hide information from you. Like, but like we're just gonna be done with this. If you don't want to be here, we'll be done with it.
Yeah, I mean, my default is doing the second thing that Nick said, whereas if someone is having so much of a bad time that they're willing to ceaselessly complain to me about the things that are going on or how BS my army is or how little fun they're having, okay, I'm not enjoying that game either. So now we're at the spot where I'm just going to just destroy you as efficiently as I possibly can to get out of there because you're, being just a POS to me. So what, if I've given you ample opportunity to be kind and be nice and lose with grace, and you just continue to not do that, I'm under no obligation to try to help you out. I'm just going to move on from the game that we're having.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I come down somewhere in the middle of you two. like I said earlier, you're not your opponent's therapist. It's not your job to regulate their emotions. But I definitely have a good time trying to make the game about something else. Either move the conversation away from what's happening on the table. So now it's like, yeah, whatever's happening over here, who cares? You don't want to hear the specifics. Tell me about Oda. Tell me about your army. Tell me about your paint scheme. Tell me about this, that, or the other thing. And what's this cool thing that's going on? How was your last game? Tell me about anything other than what's happening in front of us. And then, yeah, I have gotten to the point where I respond to I respond to complaints that my army is bullshit with just like dead face agreement. You're like, oh my god, GSC, this is the most horseshit thing ever. You did so much fucking damage in your shooting phase. I literally there's nothing I could have done. Yeah, man, it's awful. Just absolutely terrible. So broken. Moving on. And just keep going, right? Like, I'm a really argumentative person, and I really want to respond to that with like all of these logical explanations of how I had to jump through like 3 or 4 hoops to get to where you're at. And like, whenever you feel yourself having that urge to say, no, it's not that, like, I like to justify what you're doing, just like remember what it's like to play against Dark Angels and be like, oh yeah, no. Like that's what it feels like right now. Whether that's the reality of the situation or not, it feels to my opponent like I am a mouth-breathing slob, just an absolute Neanderthal who is winning because I'm bringing stupid stuff. Fine. I don't care, right? Whether my opponent thinks GSC are broken or not does not affect my personal happiness. I know that what I'm doing is complicated, and I can be really excited about it and tell my friends about it later. And I don't need to start an argument with them about game balance in the middle of me kicking their ass. Let me focus focus all that mental energy on the next game that actually matters. It's kind of where I've come down on this. Cool. All right.
That was a good
That's
discussion.
at the end of the slides. Yeah, I'm very pleased. Any closing thoughts? If you got questions in the comments, now's the time to throw anything at us before we
wow, I
wrap up.
see how it is, guys. I don't get a nickname. I guess I'm just not cool enough.
We're getting there slowly.
Where's that thing Sam said about like lanky green bean pole something or other? I want that to be my nickname.
There you go. Any closing thoughts from you guys on sportsmanship before we sign off?
No, I think this was a good discussion. I hope you guys in the audience all had fun. Thank you for participating as well. It's important stuff. I mean, we're all here to have fun at the end of the day, and we all pursue that goal in different ways. So it's cool to get to see it from other people's perspective. Yeah.
I think it's good to keep this up as like an ongoing conversation too. You know, people have any questions about it or any comments about what we've said. I'm sure that we view these situations differently than others do in the 40K community. And I mean, you know, if there's enough buzz, we'll probably be back to talk about more of this in the future. But yeah.
Absolutely. If you want to keep the conversation going and you're on YouTube, drop a comment. Or if you're not on YouTube, go to YouTube to drop a comment. Or check us out on our Patreon exclusive Discord at patreon.com/bestintabletop. We'd be happy to talk more about stuff there. I want to plug a couple things before we sign off for the week. I don't feel the need to plug Tau Tipping, event in Hoquiam, Washington, coming up at the end of April because they're already basically sold out. But what's not yet sold out, because we have so much room for this awesome event, is Pecking Order Brood Wars coming up. That's going to be at the end, not the end of May, the beginning of June. I believe it's June 3rd and 4th. 5-man teams event in Olympia, Washington. Team 40K is the best 40K. Be there, be square. It's going to be a ball and a biscuit. That's going to be great. If you're not on the YouTube, head over to the YouTube, subscribe, check out what we've got going on over there. We got more bit reps going up regularly. We just had one go up this last week of Lucas's Orcs into Nick's Votan. If you think that Votan are not fun to play into, raise your hand. Oops. Well, there's some great tips in that video on how to deal with them. I'm kidding, Nick. We love playing into you. That army's just never fun for anyone.
Oh, it's an army.
It's one of the armies of all time. So check that out. And, reviews and stuff are all appreciated. We got merch at stored up at bestintabletop.com/store with our silly logos on it. Really appreciate you all tuning in to this episode. Look forward to hearing your thoughts. We will be back, I believe, next week. Unless I'm missing something.
Next Saturday,
day before Easter. Very exciting. Back at our usual 10, definitely not 10:15 in slot. I don't even know what we're going to talk about just yet, but it should be nice. Kind of some recap stuff before we get into a really busy late April through June. Honestly, it's going to be real exciting. Maybe we'll talk about 10th edition. Who knows? Anyway, anything else you guys want to say before we sign off for the day?
No.
Fantastic.
Thanks
for
the good conversation, lads.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, real shout out to the chat today for bringing the talk. But with that all being said and done, thank you so much for listening. I've been Tyler.
I've been Nick.
All Dark Angel players fail the most basic of sportsmanship checks.
He's Lucas, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.
Wow,
Oh, dear God.